The tribal mind is the original operating system of human consciousness. It's wired into our DNA through hundreds of thousands of years of small group living. What we're experiencing now is a kind of catastrophic phase transition where that tribal instinct is being stretched across 7 billion people through digital networks. And the result is psychotic. We can't coexist with global consciousness until we actually acknowledge that we're trying to force a Paleolithic operating system to run on a space-age machine.
But you see, the whole problem is that you're treating consciousness as if it's something that can be upgraded or fixed, as though there's a technical solution to what's essentially a philosophical confusion. The tribal mind and global consciousness aren't really separate things competing for dominance. They're just different scales of the same fundamental game. The trouble is we're taking it all too seriously, as if the global order is some kind of emergency that needs solving rather than a situation that calls for wu-wei or going along with it.
But that's precisely where I think you're being complacent, Alan. Wu-wei is beautiful in a garden or a monastery, but when you've got industrial civilization barreling toward ecological collapse, when tribal networks are being weaponized by algorithms designed to amplify our worst collective instincts, that's not a time for gentle acceptance. We need an archaic revival, a return to the psychedelic plant wisdom that kept humans synchronized with nature and with each other on a truly human scale. The shamanic worldview understood something we've forgotten.
You're romanticizing the past, which is exactly what prevents us from seeing the present clearly. The shamanic worldview also had tribal warfare, human sacrifice, and profound suffering. It's just easier to mythologize it from a distance. And here's the thing, you keep talking as if there's some separate we that needs to make decisions and enact revival. But the universe isn't a problem to be solved by applying the right technique or taking the right plants. You're still caught in the Western obsession with doing rather than being.
Being without doing is a luxury of the already safe, Alan. I respect that perspective. But it assumes a kind of equilibrium that simply doesn't exist. We're in a novelty cascade. Time is accelerating fractally, and the amount of complexity packed into each moment is exponentially increasing. The tribal mind evolved for a world of maybe 50 people you know personally. The global mind is trying to process billions of strangers in real time. Something has to give. And I'm arguing that the only way forward is through a radical transformation of consciousness, which means, yes, taking responsibility for our own cognitive evolution.
But when you say something has to give, you're still operating from a crisis mentality. What if the acceleration you're describing is simply what happens when the universe becomes conscious of itself through the medium of technology? There's no emergency, no need to fix anything. The global consciousness you fear isn't some external imposition, it's us. And the tribal mind isn't being lost, it's being expressed at a different frequency. You're treating them as enemies when they're actually the same snake eating its tail at different scales.
The snake eating its tail is a beautiful image, but it's incomplete. That Ouroboros implies a closed system, a stable recursion. What we're actually in is an open system that's eating faster than it can digest. Look at social media. The tribal bonding mechanism has been hacked. We have the neural architecture to create in-group, out-group bonds, and the algorithms know this intimately. So now we get tribal conflict at a global scale, which is precisely the opposite of what you're suggesting. We need to consciously redesign our relationship to these technologies before they finalize this catastrophic pattern.
You're absolutely right about the hacking of tribal mechanisms, I'll grant you that, but your solution still assumes that consciousness is something we can redesign through intelligence and willpower. What I'm suggesting is that the very act of trying to control the outcome is what perpetuates the problem. The moment you stop fighting the algorithm and start understanding yourself as already embedded in it, already part of the system, you have a different relationship to it. It's like trying to escape the ocean, you're already water.
I hear the paradox you're offering, but it feels like spiritual sedation to me. Yes, we're embedded in the system, but that doesn't mean we're powerless. The shamans understood something crucial. Consciousness isn't passive, it shapes reality. The ayahuasca visions aren't escapes from reality. They're technologies for restructuring how we perceive and therefore interact with consensus reality. If enough people undergo genuine cognitive transformation, the attractor basin of our civilization shifts. That's not controlling nature, that's collaborating with it at a deeper level of participation.
Now we're getting somewhere interesting. You're right that consciousness shapes reality, but I'd say it's even more radical than that. Consciousness and reality aren't separate things having a conversation. When you invoke the shamanic perspective, you're pointing toward non-duality, which is exactly what I've been saying, but then you immediately build a program around it, a methodology, a thing to achieve. The instant you do that, you've created a new duality, the self that wants to transform and the consciousness that needs transforming. The tribal mind and global consciousness can coexist the moment we stop trying to orchestrate their relationship.
But the tribal mind in its current expression is actively harming the global system. Tribalism isn't neutral. It's not merely a scale issue. We see it constantly. Nationalist movements, religious fundamentalisms, in-group bias amplified to paranoid levels. These aren't just expressions of non-duality, they're expressions of alienation. And I do think there's value in the doing, in the practice. The non-duality you're describing sounds like it arrives through grace, but I've seen something different. When people ingest psilocybin or DMT in the right set and setting, they experience directly the dissolution of tribal boundaries. That's not a methodology that creates duality. It's a tool that reveals the already existing non-duality.
I'm not opposed to psychedelics. I think they can be profound tools for insight. But here's my concern. You're still using them as a means to an end, which is transformation toward a better state. The people who have the deepest realizations on these medicines, in my observation, are often the ones who stop trying to use the experience to change anything. They take it and something releases. And about tribalism causing harm, of course it does in this context. But the solution isn't to erase tribal identity, it's to see through the illusion of separation that makes tribal identity seem real and necessary in the first place.
We might not be as far apart as it seems. You're saying see through the illusion, I'm saying catalyze direct experience of non-duality. The difference is, I think the direct experience is more transformative than intellectual understanding. A person who's intellectually convinced they're not separate is still vulnerable to fear, to tribal instinct when the stakes rise, but someone who's had their nervous system reorganized by the experience of ego death, that's a different creature. They don't need to practice non-duality, they've become it. The global consciousness that emerges from millions of people in that state would be genuinely different from what we have now.
That might be true, and I'm not going to argue against the power of direct experience. But I'll offer this. The person who's had ego death and thinks they've become something special, who now sees themselves as enlightened or transformed, that's still the ego just in disguise. The real coexistence of tribal mind and global consciousness happens when you stop trying to become anything, when you realize that the ground of being that's having the experience of both tribal belonging and cosmic connection is what you already are, and yes, direct experience can point to that, but only if it doesn't become another achievement to claim.
Now that's actually wise, and I take the rebuke where we land, I think, is this. The tribal mind and global consciousness can coexist only when enough humans have fractured the illusion of separation that tribalism depends on, whether that happens through meditation, psychedelics, catastrophe, or some combination. I don't know anymore, but what I'm certain of is that without some kind of radical shift in the direction of genuine empathy and understanding of our fundamental interconnection, the tribal instinct will consume the global infrastructure and will collapse into something darker. So maybe the question isn't whether they can coexist, it's whether we can grow up fast enough to let them